Wildfire is a natural part of the Southwest landscape. Our forests have been shaped over millennia by the destructive and creative power of fire. But over the last 2 decades, there's been a dramatic shift in the nature of fire. These changes have caught the attention of researchers who are particularly interested in how areas burned under high severity respond and eventually recover. Do high severity burns lead to conversion to new forest types or a shift from forests to shrublands or grasslands? How do wildlife respond to changing habitats? And finally, what do these changes tell us about how these ecosystems will respond to climate change? We visited the site of the 2000 Pumpkin Fire. The Pumpkin Fire burned through mixed conifer and ponderosa pine on Kendrick Mountain and left a number of large high-severity patches.
After this 2000 fires, they had the rodeo sky, the wallow fire, so we're starting to get a lot of people very concerned about what the trajectory of these high-severity patches are. Ponderosa pine has a relatively heavy seed, so it's limited in terms of how far it can seed into these high-severity patches. The other factor is that some of these areas are getting dominated by re-sprouters, so a lot of the gamble oak or some of the Madrean oaks from the Sky Islands are taking over these sites. So there's worry that these areas that were once forested historically are going to be converted into another forest type or maybe perhaps a shrub type. Based on research in terms of how these areas are recovering, what is a good maximum high severity patch that you think that we can live with?
If fire is really going to act, randomly and in a way that creates that spatial diversity and arrangement that we're looking for, or that we think is the most beneficial, we need to be looking at how much maybe across larger landscapes do we have to support different species or different, whether it be plants, wildlife, trees, whatever that we're looking for, and not just focused on each individual fire and was this too much here? There are winners and losers in terms of, high severity fire and changes in the forest. And, for some animals, more high severity fire you get, the better off they may be. If you have large high severity patches, maybe less hiding cover, but really good opportunities for turkey and some other different species during different life history stages. But when you're talking about maybe other forest dwelling birds, like Mexican spotted owls or forest thrushes, the size of that high severity, the bigger those patches get, probably the less beneficial it is. So it's not a matter of is it all bad or is it all good, it's going to be different depending on what you're looking at.
Providing that heterogeneity, it's really useful for the next fire too. So, just getting our stand structures down, so they're less dense. This is much more resistant to crown fires than it was. So having the patch of high severity next to the more open stand is definitely going to help. And with the projections of a warmer climate.
I think we know that there are different winners and losers depending on the severity of the fire in an area. We know that wildlife are much more resilient to a lot of these changes than I think we gave them credit for in the past. But we don't have very good information on patch dynamics or how those different patches need to work on the landscape in order for us to maintain certain species, i.e. like the Mexican spotted owl.
In the past, I think we've been able to pretty much say, well, even though we have this severely burned area, we will get regeneration. We'll have these amazingly wet spells where we get regeneration and it survives. And now with the projections for the Southwest in particular, we're starting to question that assumption.
Ideally, these areas should be reburning so that we're not restoring the structure of the forest, but we're restoring the process, which is the surface fires.
When you're looking at the spatial extent of the problem we have, I think to go back to burned areas is not necessarily the first priority. The objective is to try and get more fire across a bigger area. And then take opportunities, advantage of lightning and other opportunities to get back into those areas that were burned already.
We also visited the site of the 2003 Aspen Fire in the Santa Catalina Mountains in southern Arizona to discuss the role of recent fire, particularly high-severity fire, in the unique ecosystems of the Sky Islands.
The Catalinas are part of the Sky Islands region, so this is kind of like forested mountains within the desert of the Sonoran Desert. There's these elevational belts. You start at the lower elevations with the desert grasslands, and then you move up and you find these Madrean oak woodlands that transition from oak savannas into dense oak woodlands, and then they mesh into these pine oak woodlands, and then to essentially pure pine forest, and then mixed conifer forest and subalpine forest at the very top of the mountain.
Where the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Madre meet. So we've got not just ponderosa pine in the conifer belt and Doug fir that you have in the Rocky Mountains, but we've got all these pine species that you find more in Mexico. So also we have kind of a more diversity of tree species, and how does that play into how things are going to recover after this fire?
Things look a little bit more positive going in the future here than in some of the areas like the Rodeo Chetaskai, where you see these huge patches. We don't really see that big of a patch in the Sky Islands.
Right. I think the amount of high severity patches are made up about 20% of this fire, not a huge amount. And you're right. I don't think we saw any of those really big patches like you did in Rodeo Chetaskai and Wallow and other fires like that. It's not to say that all of those patches are just shrubs resprouting. We do see some tree regeneration in certain pockets. In some cases, really dense tree regeneration. So we also don't quite know kind of what the trajectory of those areas are going to be. So I think one of the things we expect, right, with climate change, with these Sky Islands, most people agree that all those different vegetation bands that are kind of you know about from classic ecology, they're going to move up in elevation, right? That's what we expect. And there is a recent study that suggests that maybe these fires could kind of accelerate that change. So in some of the higher elevation, really high severity areas, they're seeing species that you normally find at lower elevation establishing. So that's something we expect, is the climate's going to warm and dry, but it could be that these fires are kind of accelerating that.
Another aspect of this whole fire is what happens to those areas that reburn multiple times. And I think the great example of that one is the 1994 fire, the Rattlesnake and the Chiricahuas. And then all that area reburned again in the 2011 Horseshoe 2 fire. So basically a good chunk of the Chiricahuas have burned twice already. And so the trajectories are going to be very different in those areas. The other thing about that fire, though, is that 2011 was really warm, dry year. So that fire was relatively severe in places. And some places that had survived as a low severity the first time in '94 actually burned hot, high severity the second time. You want to see areas that burn low severity the first time to become more resilient and more resistant to standard placing fire the second time. But that's not always the case, especially in those really dry years like 2011.
In those years, yeah.
One of the unique aspects of the Sky Islands is that, like Molly was saying, you get these species that are coming in from the north and these species coming in from the south, and that's particularly important when you talk about bird species. There's a lot of neotropical migrants that come and cross into the Sky Islands, but they really don't go much further than this. And so the avian community is really unique in this area. So we established a number of transects, about 5 transects in the 5 major mountain ranges in the Sky Islands in the 90s. Since then, a lot of these mountain ranges have burned, and they've experienced different fires and different fire severities. And so we had a crew that came out here last year and reestablished the points and remeasured them in terms of birds. Some of the preliminary analysis are starting to show that in these communities, because there's higher diversity, there's more habitat for these birds. We're seeing a higher diversity of bird species in these areas. I think the diversity of these Sky Islands in that sense and the fires might actually make it more resilient going forward in terms of climate change. Fire creates more diversity and creates change, and sometimes that change is viewed in a negative manner, but in ecological terms, sometimes that change is a good change,
Right.
Whether we like it or not.
Right, yeah.